All right, we're working our way through the Bible, and we've come to the Gospels, and specifically we're looking at the Gospel of Mark. And obviously we're doing a little bit of work and talking about the background and all of that, but really the reason why we're doing that is because we want to hear God speak to us through the Bible. And we have to work at getting out of the way. God has something that he wants to say to us, and specifically he wants to show us the glory of Jesus. But so often our heads are filled with this or that, and we are tempted to make the Bible into our own image. And so we really have to work hard and pray as we work that God doesn't allow us to do that. And one of the ways we work at really hearing God as he speaks to us in the Bible is making sure as we approach a book that we've really thought about some of the background kind of issues, like who actually wrote it and why did he write it. And we saw in our last video that Mark was, shocker, written by Mark. Probably what Mark was doing was writing down some of the sermons that he had heard Peter preach, or stories that he had heard Peter told. He probably was writing this, almost you might say, on behalf of Peter. And he was writing this to Roman God-fearers, or probably Roman, more specifically Roman Christians. And that was his first audience. Of course, God intended this book to be for more than just them. We're glad about that. But it was written originally for Roman Christians. And knowing that isn't just a little bit of detail. It actually is helpful because it gives us a little bit of insight into what might have been motivating Mark as he wrote this gospel, because the Romans were suffering. Specifically, and I shouldn't just say it like that, the Roman Christians were suffering. Thinking specifically about the church in Rome gives us some things to have in mind as we read the Gospel of Mark, because obviously he's writing for real people who are experiencing real issues and real pressures, and we're going to experience certain things in the future, actually. And one thing we know about the church in Rome, and what it was going to face, what it was facing, but even more than that, what it was going to face, is that they were going to face some severe persecution. The church in Rome was going to suffer. The early church in general, of course, suffered, at least many of the believers in the early church, from the beginning. In fact, Mark's mentor, Peter, warned in general of fiery trials that were going to come upon believers in 1 Peter 4 and 5, and even Jesus, as he talks to the disciples about what this era that we're living in is going to be like, described it as a cross-like era. This is an era of suffering. And Peter, as he talks about the suffering that believers are going to face, describes it as a fiery trial. And when he describes it as a fiery trial, he's actually with Mark in Rome. He was looking out at the world, and maybe even Rome, and saw Satan prowling around like a roaring lion, looking for whom he can devour. And he spoke of this as normal. And historically, we know this was not just true of the early church in general, but specifically was something that happened in a big way for believers in Rome. You've probably heard of Nero the emperor. Well, Nero would have made a good dictator, proud, selfish, and at a certain point in the early 60s, Nero was wanting to build himself a palace, and there wasn't a lot of room in Rome to do that. Rome was a crowded city. It was a large city. I believe the largest city of its day, something like 1.5 million people. And so Nero had to make some space. And he found a particular part of the city, a poor part of the city that was somewhat separated from the rest, which he thought if he cleared, he could use to build his palace. And so Nero left the city because he didn't want to be blamed, but he seems to have sent out men with flaming torches into that part of the city, and they were throwing these torches into certain shops. And when people tried to stop them, they said they were acting on imperial orders. And so, of course, the shops and buildings started to burn when the unexpected happened, and there were gusts of wind that started sweeping through the city. And of course, that wind picked up pieces of wood and other things that were on fire and started carrying the fire throughout the rest of the city. In fact, they had divided Rome into 14 different districts, and it wasn't long until 10 out of the 14 districts had caught fire. And this was a massive fire One Roman historian said it took something like 2 weeks to get the fire under control again. And when the flames were put out, the emperor did what he could. He made sacrifices to the gods. He started on this massive building program. He lowered the price of grain because famine was a genuine threat. But Tacitus, this historian who writes at this time, said that none of that really did him any good with the people, because the people were convinced that he was the one who started the fire, and so he needed to suppress that like any good politician. And so he fabricated a scapegoat and fastened the guilt, Tacitus says, and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. And that's interesting, because Tacitus says Christianity was checked for a moment, but then broke out again. And why is that? We know it's because of the resurrection, and that's why the gospel made it to Rome eventually. And Nero thought that Christians were good scapegoats for the burning of Rome, and Tacitus continues, accordingly, an arrest was made of all who pleaded guilty. Then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs, or perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. That's the kind of persecution these early believers were facing, and we should take a moment and feel that, because these believers were family to us. We are connected to these early believers who suffered under Nero, and all that persecution which the church was facing, if Mark was writing in the 60s, or was about to face if he was writing in the 50s, would have caused the church to ask some questions. And so one thing Mark does, as he looks at the life of Christ and the teachings of Christ, is highlight some particular truths that would have brought comfort and strength to the believers who are being persecuted. And listen to some of the ways Mark does that. Specifically, that is maybe just a little different than the other gospel writers. For example, Mark 1:13, as Mark talks about the temptation of Jesus, he doesn't actually describe the temptations themselves, but you know what Mark adds? He says Jesus was with the wild beasts. And that is a phrase that's easy for us to read over, of course, but if you were a Christian in Rome, there was a time coming when living for Jesus was going to cost you your life, and one of the ways they were killing Christians was by bringing them into the Colosseum, where they were going to be eaten by lions and other wild beasts. And then you read in Mark, Jesus was with the wild beasts. Jesus knows. I'm not the first to go through this temptation. Jesus went through this before me. That's only in the Gospel of Mark. Or Mark 3:19, you get a list of the disciples of Jesus, and it's a traditional list, but it ends with Judas Iscariot, the betrayer. And of course, we find references to Jesus and his betrayal in all the Gospels, and here in Mark, he highlights Judas is the betrayer, and part of why he highlights that is because one of the saddest aspects of persecution is the fact that often you are betrayed by people you think are your friends, just like Jesus. Mark 4:17, Mark records the parable of the sower, and even in this parable, he gives encouragement to the persecuted. He talks about, or actually encouragement and a warning, really. He talks about the seed who has no root, and it lasts only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, Jesus says they quickly fall away, and that's a warning, of course. Persecution, Jesus says, is going to reveal who really are believers, but it's also, in a sense, an encouragement when your heart is breaking because you are seeing people fall and specifically fall away from Jesus, you discover in Mark, Jesus knew this was coming, and he warned us of it. In Mark 8:34, Jesus makes a famous statement about discipleship. Jesus calls the crowd and he says, if any would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And we can think of how Christians in Rome would have heard this. They would have heard Jesus saying martyrdom wasn't something surprising, but was part of the call to follow him. In Mark 9:49, Jesus talks about being salted by fire, and Christians would go through deep fires. They would experience a trial by fire, and only Mark brings out that Jesus even said this. Peter came to Jesus in Mark chapter 10, verse 30, and said, we left everything to follow you. What will be our reward? And Jesus reminds him of the rewards God has for those who follow him. But notice what he says at the end. How does Jesus qualify his statement in Mark? Who will receive 100-fold now in this time, houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands, with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. Only Mark remembers that Jesus said this. And why? Because he's writing for a persecuted church. One scholar calls Mark a pamphlet for hard times. And one way he encourages believers is by bringing out some of these details. Jesus knew this was the way it's going to be. Don't be surprised by what you're experiencing. Jesus went through this before you. But ultimately, the most important way he encourages persecuted believers is by having them look at Jesus himself. So Mark's about the Christian life, and Mark certainly wants to help us know how to respond to persecution. But first and foremost, of course, Mark, what's his purpose? He's about Jesus. It's like we can only understand our life now as Christians by looking at Jesus's life. And you know, Mark's a subtle author in some ways. But one thing I don't think he's subtle about is the subject of his book. This is very clear. He tells us straight in the introduction. Look at it. Mark 1:1. It is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus. That's pretty much the only place that Mark speaks for himself, so it's important. And he's saying, this is what this gospel is about. It's about Jesus. And in case we miss it, he makes Jesus the subject of every story in the book, except for two, which are about John the Baptist, whose entire ministry was to point people to Jesus. So really, if you want to be stirred to worship, you want to read Mark in line with Mark's purpose, you want to obviously be encouraged to stand up for Jesus, you want to learn a little bit about discipleship, of course, all of that. But if you want to read Mark in line with Mark's purpose, one of the things you definitely want to do is ask, what does Mark tell me about Jesus? How does Mark put Jesus Christ on display? You might take the first chapter just as an example. I did this a while back and I made a list of everything that Mark tells us about Jesus just in the first chapter. Listen to it. Jesus is the center of the gospel, Mark 1:1. He's the Son of God, Mark 1:1. He's the Messiah, Mark 1:1. He's Lord, Mark 1:3. He's the point of John the Baptist's ministry, Mark 1:2-8. He's mightier than John the Baptist, Mark 1:7. He's so important that John the Baptist didn't feel worthy to untie his shoe, Mark 1:7. He's the one who baptized with the Holy Spirit, Mark 1:8. He's the beloved Son of God, Mark 1:11. God is well pleased with him, Mark 1:11. He was controlled by the Spirit, Mark 1:12. He was hated by Satan, Mark 1:13. He was served by the angels, Mark 1:13. He was a preacher of the gospel, Mark 1:14. He was the fulfillment of all that God's been doing in the world. He was able to command people to change their lives with authority, Mark 1:15. The gospel that Mark says is his in chapter 1, verse 1 is also the gospel that he says is God's in Mark 1:15. He chooses men to follow him, 1:17. He's able to command men to leave their occupations and follow him, 1:17. He's able to transform men from fishermen to fishers of men. He's willing to intimately associate with regular people, 1:17. He was an amazing teacher, 1:22. He taught with an authority greater than that of the greatest authorities in Israel at the time, 1:22. He was acclaimed as the Holy One of God by demons, 1:24. He was able to rebuke demons with mere words and have them listen and obey, 1:27. He was famous in Galilee for a time, 1:28. He was willing to listen to pleas for help, 1:30. He was able to heal with just a touch of his hand, 131. He was able to heal all kinds of different sicknesses and cast out all sorts of different demons, 132. He was willing to serve demanding crowds, 132 and 33. He didn't allow demons to tell people who he was, 134. After a long night of service, he went out in the early morning to pray, 135. He was unwilling to capitalize on his fame for material prosperity or temporary glory, 138. He was clearly aware of why he came into the world, 138. He came to preach. He reacts differently to the unclean in Jewish society than typical rabbis would. When a leper comes to him, he doesn't run away, he doesn't throw stones, but he allows him to approach him and even touches him, 141. He was able to heal leprosy, the unhealable disease, with a touch, 141. He was willing to do that, 141. He was moved with compassion for those who were hurting. He was obedient to the law, 144. The authority over demons, sickness, and he had authority over demons, sickness, and even uncleannesses, 124, 1 through 45. He was willing to heal people who made life more difficult for him, 145. And that's just the first chapter. That's like 42 statements about the person of Jesus. It's obvious who this book is about. Mark writes to help you see how beautiful Jesus is. And in case we somehow miss that, which we really can't, Mark gives us other clues that his book is about Jesus. The introduction tells us it's about Jesus. The content shows us that it's about Jesus, but so does the style. One example, if you read Mark straight through, you'll notice that he's got pivotal questions scattered throughout. And there's one kind of question that especially stands out. It has to do with Jesus. Listen to the following passages. Note the question that's asked. 127. What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits and they obey him. Chapter 2, verse 7. Why does this fellow blaspheme like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Chapter 2, verse 16. Why does he eat with sinners? Chapter 4, verse 41. Who then is this that even the wind and the water obey him? Chapter 6, verse 2. Where did this man get his wisdom? Chapter 7, verse 5. Why do your disciples not live by tradition? In other words, over and over, who is Jesus? What kind of person is this? And all these questions lead up to a climactic moment in chapter 8 where Jesus turns to his disciples and asks, chapter 8, verse 27, who do people say that I am? And he doesn't leave it there. Chapter 8, verse 29, who do you say that I am? Mark has many people asking questions about Jesus, but always pay attention when Jesus starts asking questions back, because you're seeing what's really important. Who do you say that I am? Introduction, content, style. Mark is all about answering the question, who is Jesus really? There's no more important question for you to consider and for us to be able to answer. We don't come together to worship a Jesus of our own imaginations. We want to worship the Jesus who actually existed. And the only way we can know the Jesus who actually existed is to listen to the Gospels as they reveal to us who he is. And in our next video, we're going to see exactly who Mark reveals Jesus to be.